A cop tries to humiliate a black woman, unaware she's a decorated military intelligence officer. The night air crackled with tension the moment Officer Corey Diaz pulled over the glossy black SUV. He could barely see the driver, only aware of her silhouette against the glow of a passing street lamp. Something about the car, too fancy, too sleek, made him suspicious. As he approached, he rehearsed his usual lines in his head, that tone laced with condescension he thought would keep her in her place. Little did he know, this was no ordinary driver. This was Lieutenant Colonel Fiona Blue, a decorated U.S. Army military intelligence officer, trained to spot threats and dismantle them before they ever took shape. Fiona Blue's life had never been simple. Even before she joined the Army, she was the kind of person who was always on the move. Growing up in a small town in Georgia, she'd learned from a young age that the world didn't always offer second chances to girls who looked like her. But she had a fire in her eyes, and she had a conviction that she would rise above every barrier placed in her path. So, when she left home at 18 and enrolled in the University of Maryland, she was fueled by a dream of joining the military. Her father had been a sergeant in the Marines before a knee injury ended his career. He taught her about self-discipline and patriotism, about standing up for what was right, no matter the personal cost. Fiona took every piece of advice, welded it onto her sense of self, and persevered. Fresh out of college with a degree in political science, Fiona joined the U.S. Army and headed straight into military intelligence. She trained tirelessly, focusing on cryptologic linguistics first, then expanding her skill set into counterintelligence. When officers looked at her, they saw discipline, brilliance, and unwavering determination. Despite the occasional prejudice from some corners of the service, her record spoke louder than any skeptic. She garnered promotions and commendations, culminating in her recent promotion to lieutenant colonel. And yet, for all her training, for all her accolades, Fiona had learned how to move quietly through civilian life. In her mind, there was no need to flaunt her rank and achievements to strangers, especially not if it risked overshadowing the very reason she'd earned those accolades in the first place. She wanted no special treatment, no illusions. She was proud of who she was, but that pride was a personal matter. On a breezy fall evening, having just returned stateside from a short deployment, Fiona was driving to her hometown in Georgia to surprise her father for his upcoming birthday. She drove a glossy black SUV, an early gift to herself after her last promotion, and kept her license and registration in a neat folder. It was late, the roads mostly empty, and she felt that sense of anticipation for homecoming. The old silver ring on her finger, a memento from her first tour overseas, glinted under the passing street lights. She tapped gently on the steering wheel, humming along to an old R&B station. That's when she noticed red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. A cold rush of adrenaline hit her chest. She wasn't speeding, hadn't changed lanes erratically. Why was she being pulled over? She told herself, stay calm, stay collected. She'd been through real combat zones, had outsmarted insurgents who'd tried to intercept critical intelligence. This should be nothing more than a routine traffic stop, she told herself, but the memory of how traffic stops sometimes ended for people who looked like her nagged at her mind. Still, Fiona pulled over onto the narrow shoulder. She turned off her music, put the car in park, and folded her hands in her lap. Her heart thumped in her ears, but her expression remained neutral. She was used to controlling her nerves under pressure. Outside her window, the policeman's silhouette was illuminated by the swirling red and blue haze of the patrol car's lights. He seemed to stand there for a moment, as though sizing her up through the tinted glass. Fiona rolled down her window, her driver's license and registration already in hand. Her life had always been extraordinary in some ways, but to outside eyes, she was just another driver on a lonely stretch of road. For Fiona, that was exactly how she liked it, until she discovered that anonymity could also be a weapon used against her. Officer Corey Diaz prided himself on his instincts. In the small county police department, he believed he was the toughest, the most diligent, and the most deserving of respect. In his eyes, he had a duty to keep the peace, yet his methods drew questions from colleagues in town, people alike who noticed he favored heavier enforcement against certain groups of people. He chalked it up to criminal statistics, never acknowledging his bias as something deeper and far uglier. Diaz's father had been a state trooper, and his grandfather too. His entire family lineage dripped with the authority of a badge. Growing up, Diaz was taught that wearing the uniform placed him in a special position of power. For him, this power was more than just a responsibility. It was a privilege that gave him license to treat people however he deemed fit. Tonight, as he cruised the long stretch of highway just outside of Atlanta, his eyes landed on the black SUV that Fiona was driving. Something about the expensive rims and the tinted windows set off Diaz's prejudice. In his mind, it was probably another punk from the city up to no good in his county. He switched on the sirens and watched with grim satisfaction as the SUV slowed and pulled to the side. Before stepping out, he radioed in. "Pulling over a suspicious vehicle," he said, "possibly stolen. Will advise once I have a red." There had been zero indication that Fiona's car was stolen. Diaz hadn't even run the plates yet, but he was playing a hunch fueled by ignorance and bigotry. As Diaz approached the driver's side, he tried to compose his face into an authoritarian scowl. The driver's window rolled down. With a flick of his flashlight, he saw Fiona's face. She was a black woman, mid-30s, well-groomed, but obviously tired from a long drive. Diaz felt an inexplicable surge of annoyance. Fiona offered a polite nod. "Good evening, officer." Her voice was calm, practiced. She dealt with all manner of authority figures, from generals to commanding officers, and had learned that a respectful tone often diffused tension. "Driver's license and registration," Diaz barked, shining his flashlight into her eyes. He wanted her off balance. Still calm, she handed them over. "Here you are, sir." Diaz took them without a word and stepped back to his patrol car. He shoved the documents into his laptop's card reader, not bothering to read the name carefully. If he had, he might have noticed the small detail that her driver's license photo was taken on a military base, or at least recognized the significance of the letters LTC on her registration. Though it wasn't always standard for a personal vehicle, some states allowed military rank designations on certain documents. Diaz's system took a moment to process the license and registration. Fiona's record was, of course, squeaky clean, no infractions other than a few minor speeding tickets from a decade ago. Diaz rubbed his chin. That wasn't enough to satisfy him. He decided he would question her about the vehicle's ownership, but before returning to the SUV, Diaz took a mental inventory of all the ways he could escalate the situation. He felt a strange need to demonstrate his authority, to show that in this county, he was in charge. When Diaz came back, he didn't hand the papers over right away. Instead, he aimed the flashlight directly at Fiona's face again. "What are you doing driving this SUV out here at this hour?" Fiona blinked against the beam of light. "I'm on my way to my hometown to visit family. It's late, so the road's a bit empty, but I'm not speeding." Diaz ignored her measured tone. "Mind stepping out of the vehicle for me?" She glanced at him, reading his body language. Fiona had encountered hostility in foreign lands during intelligence missions, and she recognized the undercurrent of tension in Diaz's stance. Technically, she could refuse unless he had probable cause. She also knew how quickly such refusals turned dangerous in confrontations with officers like him. With a deep breath, she nodded. "All right, officer." She opened the door and stepped onto the gravel shoulder. The night air was colder than she expected. Her boots crunched on the loose stones. Diaz stood at an angle, his hand close to his holstered gun. "Hands where I can see them," Diaz snapped. Fiona complied, lifting her hands slightly as she turned to face him. The irony of it all struck her. She had spent her life defending the freedoms of Americans, including the uniform this officer wore, and yet, she stood here, hands raised, being treated like a criminal. Diaz's eyes roved over her quickly. "This your car?" Fiona nodded. "Yes, sir. The registration is in my name." Diaz squinted at the papers in his hand, finally reading them properly. "Fiona Blue," he read out loud. "This says you're a lieutenant colonel." He sneered at the word. "What? Are you in the Army?" She met his gaze. "Yes, sir. U.S. Army Military Intelligence." He let out a cold laugh. "Yeah, sure you are. Got a uniform on you." She shook her head. "I'm on leave, heading to my father's for his birthday. I'm not wearing my uniform." Diaz took a step closer. Fiona suppressed the instinctual desire to step back. In her training, stepping back was a sign of fear or might provoke escalation from a hostile. She stood firm, but non-threatening. "Ma'am, I need you to turn around," he said, as though she were a suspect. "I'm going to pat you down for weapons." She blinked. "Is there a reason you suspect I'm armed or dangerous?" she asked calmly. Diaz's upper lip curled. It's standard procedure, he said dismissively, although it wasn't standard for a simple traffic stop without cause. Fiona briefly considered resisting or asking for a supervisor, but the tension in Diaz's voice told her that refusing would only make things worse. Gritting her teeth, she turned around and allowed him to pat her down. His touch was rough, and she felt an anger rising in her chest. She had faced enemy soldiers, terrorists, and foreign agents, but this felt more degrading. This was supposed to be home. "All right," Diaz said. "Keep those hands out where I can see them. Don't move unless I say." Fiona exhaled slowly. This was quickly escalating from a traffic stop to something far more sinister, and it was clear that this officer had no idea whom he was dealing with, nor the training she possessed to handle intense situations. Behind Fiona's calm eyes, 1,000 strategies flickered. She wondered how far Diaz intended to push this, and how she might have to respond if he crossed a line. For now, she did what she did best. She observed, she collected data, memorizing Diaz's nameplate, noticing the slight tremor in his left hand, the scuffed toes of his boots, the way his radio crackled with static from dispatch. She noted the direction of the wind, the lights of the nearest gas station about a mile ahead, and she realized that if Diaz decided to do something truly unhinged, they were very much alone. Drama was unfolding, step by step, and she was certain that it was far from over. Officer Diaz forced Fiona to remain standing beside her vehicle for nearly 15 minutes while he performed what he called a thorough investigation. He opened every compartment of her SUV, rifling through her belongings without permission. Fiona knew that, legally, he should have had probable cause or her consent to search her vehicle, but he had demanded she remain silent and still. Her mind churned with conflicting emotions. She wanted to speak up, to assert her rights, but she also knew how quickly things could escalate, especially if the officer carried any deep-seated animosity. If Diaz found anything, even benign items, he might twist it into a reason to arrest her. Finally, Diaz shut the last compartment. He walked back around to where Fiona stood, his face twisted in a smug grin. "You planning to tell me why you need so much gear in your trunk?" Fiona had a standard army duffel bag with some personal items, spare clothes, and a few field manuals. She also had an old tactical vest that wasn't exactly standard issue, but had sentimental value. "I'm military," she repeated. "I just got back from overseas. Those are my personal effects." Diaz's shoulders shook with a short laugh. "Uh-huh, and I'm the President of the United States." Fiona clenched her jaw. "Officer, if you run my identification properly, you'll see my service record is legitimate. I've broken no laws. I'd appreciate my documents returned and the opportunity to continue my journey." He stared at her for a long moment, seemingly impressed by her composure, but unwilling to cede any ground. He turned and spat on the gravel. "Wait here," he commanded, stepping back toward his patrol car. She exhaled, letting her rigid stance loosen just enough to shake out her nerves. Even though she was highly trained, even though she had faced real combat, this scenario felt personal. This was her own country, her home, and it still felt so unwelcoming sometimes. Minutes ticked by on the side of the road. The night sky stretched wide, punctuated by distant stars. The sense of isolation weighed on Fiona. She could feel eyes on her. Diaz's beady stare from the patrol car, the radio crackle whispered half-heard words, an unintelligible conversation with dispatch. Her phone was in the SUV, lying on the driver's seat where she'd left it before exiting. She wondered if it would be wise to record the encounter, but she feared that making a sudden move toward the phone might provoke Diaz even further. Eventually, Diaz stepped out of his cruiser again. This time, he slammed the car door behind him with unnecessary force. He stalked over, brandishing her documents in one hand. "Well," he said, "it seems your license checks out. The registration is valid. So, you're free to go, I guess." The grudging tone in his voice indicated he hadn't found any reason to justify further detainment, but he still wasn't happy about it. Fiona felt relief start to blossom in her chest, but it was laced with a potent anger that this ordeal had happened at all. She reached out to take her license and registration. Diaz yanked them back before she could grasp them, as though enjoying the moment of psychological control. Then, he flicked them into the gravel at her feet. "Pick them up." Shock flared in her eyes. She wanted to demand an apology, to hold this man accountable, but the moment she opened her mouth, Diaz stepped closer again, trying to loom over her. Let's not have any trouble now, he said, that smug grin returning. We wouldn't want any kind of accident on the side of the road. Fiona's training told her that any confrontation here could spiral out of control. The best recourse would be to document and report him to the right authorities later. So, forcing down her pride, she bent down and picked up the papers. Have a good night, Diaz said, feigning politeness. Next time, don't drive around looking like a drug runner. Fiona froze. She glanced at him, the words stinging, but said nothing. Instead, she moved slowly back to her SUV, got in, and closed the door. She started the engine, her hands trembling in a way they hadn't in years. As she pulled away from the shoulder, Diaz remained in his squad car, the red and blue lights rotating in the night. Fiona watched him in her rearview mirror until he was a pinprick of color fading behind her. She was no stranger to racism, nor to the abuse of power, but having it happen so brazenly left her furious. She swallowed the anger, reminding herself that there were official channels to handle such misconduct. Perhaps she would talk to her father about it. He might advise her or know people in the local law enforcement community who could help. But the incident had shaken her. Even as she merged back onto the highway, she couldn't dispel that swirling mix of anger, hurt, and disbelief. The scathing words he'd hurled at her, accusing her of looking like a criminal, made her question how many other innocent people had suffered under his bullying. Fiona was determined it would not end here. She'd done covert operations on foreign soil. She had compiled evidence against potential threats to national security. If she needed to compile her own personal intelligence case against Officer Diaz, she was more than qualified to do so. Little did she know, this was only the beginning of their confrontation. Fate had a curious way of bringing people back together, under circumstances far more explosive than anyone could anticipate. Fiona finally arrived at her father's house in the early hours of the morning. The small suburban home had a porch light on, and she saw a shadow pass by the front window. She parked in the driveway, forcing a weary smile for the benefit of her father, who stood at the door wearing his old robe, clearly worried. As soon as she stepped inside, her father's eyes ran over her face, noting the tension in her expression. "You okay, baby girl?" he asked, his voice a hushed rumble. "It's late." Was getting worried. Fiona forced a smile, pulling him into a hug. "I'm fine, Dad. Ran into a bit of a problem on the road." He guided her into the living room. Fiona noticed the faint odor of night coffee, evidence that her father had been waiting up, sipping from an old mug that read, "Best Dad in the Marines." As they sat down, Fiona explained what happened. The humiliating stop, Officer Diaz's intimidation, the search of her vehicle, the hateful insinuations. Her father, retired Sergeant Major Kyle Blue, listened in silence, his jaw tight and his eyes filled with rage. "That son of a," he began, then caught himself. He took a breath and clenched his fists. "Some things never change. It's unbelievable that you've risked your life overseas. You've served your country with honor, and you still get treated like this." Fiona sighed, resting her elbows on her knees. "I'm not the only one, Dad. This kind of abuse happens to people all the time, especially to people who look like us." Kyle nodded, swallowing his anger. "And you said the officer's name was Diaz?" "Officer Corey Diaz. That's what his nameplate said," Fiona replied. Kyle's eyes flickered. "I'm going to make some calls tomorrow morning. We can file a complaint. We can get a lawyer if we have to." Fiona ran a hand over her short, neatly trimmed hair. "I've never been one to be vengeful, but Dad, this was more than just a typical traffic stop." There was so much hatred in his eyes. Her father pursed his lips. "Hate, that's the right word for it. Listen, you're only here for a short time. Yeah, we can push for a formal investigation. We'll get your record out there, your rank, your service awards, everything. And if that officer tries to deny it, we'll show them who you really are." Fiona slumped back against the couch, exhaustion wearing on her. "Thanks, Dad. Maybe you're right. If we let this go, he'll keep doing it." "Darn right," Kyle said. "Now you go get some rest. We'll celebrate my birthday properly, but let's handle this first. If we don't stand up to officers like him, who will?" A small smile curled the corners of Fiona's mouth. She leaned over to squeeze her father's hand. "All right, Dad. I'll rest, but first thing tomorrow, we start making calls." She did just that. She rose early, took a shower to wash away the grime of the previous night's journey, and joined her father at the kitchen table. He was already on the phone, speaking in low tones with someone from the local Veterans Affairs office. When he saw Fiona, he held up a finger, acknowledging her. Mr. Blue, he said into the phone. Yes, she is a lieutenant colonel. That's correct. We need to file a formal complaint. Yes, we'll do that. He hung up and turned to Fiona. They're putting me in touch with a legal advisor who handles civil rights complaints. In the meantime, we can file a complaint directly with the police department. Fiona nodded. Let's do it. By midday, they had driven to the local police station, a squat, single-story building with a flagpole out front. It was, ironically, close to the elementary school Fiona had attended as a child. She recognized the neighborhood, though it had changed over the years. Inside, they spoke to a duty sergeant named John Laurie, who listened intently to Fiona's story. The entire time, Fiona noticed his expression shifting from interest to worry as she mentioned Diaz's name. Officer Diaz, Laurie said, leaning back in his chair. He was a heavy-set man, hair thinning, with a calm demeanor. He's only been with us a couple of years. He transferred from a different county. We've had a few concerns raised about his conduct, but nothing official. Fiona exchanged a glance with her father. I'd like to make it official, she said. Laurie nodded. Understood. Let's get this complaint on record. Fiona provided a detailed written statement while her father watched, tension lining his face. She included everything, from Diaz's intimidation tactics to the humiliating way he threw her license and registration on the ground. Laurie typed it up diligently. Thank you, Laurie said once it was done. We'll open an internal investigation. I can't promise results immediately, but it'll be looked into. Fiona stood, smoothing the front of her shirt. I understand. If you need more from me, let me know. I'll be in town for a bit. Her father cleared his throat. Let's just hope this is the last time we have to do something like this. Laurie stood as well and offered a small, sympathetic smile. I'm sorry you had to go through this, truly. We have a lot of good officers here, but sometimes a bad apple slips through. Fiona and her father said their goodbyes and left. Outside, in the afternoon sunshine, Fiona felt a bit of weight lifted from her shoulders. She hoped that this might be the end of her dealings with Officer Diaz, that perhaps the humiliating incident had at least contributed to some accountability. But destiny, or perhaps just the twisted nature of fate, had other plans. That evening, Fiona and her father had a small birthday dinner. A couple of family friends came over, old veterans who had served with Kyle in the Marines. Fiona regaled them with some sanitized stories of her work in military intelligence, omitting classified details, of course. As she spoke, a sense of pride returned to her, overshadowing the fear and anger from the night before. If nothing else, these men and women understood service and sacrifice. They wouldn't have tolerated an ounce of disrespect toward one of their own. The next morning, Fiona woke early. Despite the comfort of her father's home, she felt restless. She decided to go for a run through her old neighborhood. The crisp Georgia air invigorated her. As her feet pounded the pavement, she thought through her next steps in addressing the misconduct complaint. She also mused about her upcoming reassignment to Fort Hood, a real place in Texas, where she'd be working on a special intelligence project. She was lost in thought when she heard a set of sirens in the distance. Normally, she would dismiss them as ordinary traffic enforcement, but as she turned a corner, she spotted a commotion near a local convenience store. A few bystanders had gathered, peering at something happening in the parking lot. Fiona jogged closer, curiosity piqued. She saw a squad car in the lot, its lights flashing, and recognized the tall figure standing by the driver's door. It was Officer Diaz. A wave of cold tension spiked through her. He was yelling at someone, a middle-aged black man in a stained mechanic's uniform. The man stood with his arms raised, clearly terrified. Fiona saw a second officer, a younger man, near the squad car, looking visibly uncomfortable with Diaz's demeanor. Fiona slowed her run to a walk and approached cautiously. Bystanders murmured among themselves, some holding up smartphones to record. It seemed Diaz had stopped the man for a minor traffic issue, but now it was escalating. You think you can mouth off to me? Diaz spat, gesturing wildly. Let's see how tough you are when I lock you up. The man, pinned by Diaz's glare, stammered. Two was just. Shut up. Diaz snapped, pressing the man against the hood of the squad car. A sense of déjà vu and outrage flooded Fiona. She stepped forward, ignoring the small voice in her head that urged caution. She had handled far greater threats than a hot-headed cop. Officer Diaz, she called in a firm voice. Let him go. Diaz's head jerked up, his eyes narrowing in recognition. He stared at Fiona. You again, he said, a sneer curling his lip. By now, the other officer glanced between Diaz and Fiona, confusion registering on his face. The onlookers stirred, their cameras aimed at the tension unfolding. Diaz's nostrils flared. "Stay out of this," he barked at Fiona. "You have no authority here." Fiona didn't back down. "I know who you are, officer, and I've seen how you handle people. You're heading down the same path you tried with me." Diaz let out a hollow laugh. "You think you can show up and bark orders? I don't care if you claim to be some big-shot soldier. You're on my turf." The man in the mechanic's uniform turned his head slightly, relief washing over his features as he realized someone was intervening. Diaz, noticing the shift, shoved him harder against the squad car. Fiona's fists clenched. "Officer, you're in public, being recorded. Let the man go." Diaz's eyes flicked to the crowd for a moment. Uncertainty wavered on his face. Then he attempted to mask it with bravado. He was resisting arrest, Diaz announced loudly. The younger officer stepped forward. "Actually, sir," he said, sounding uncertain. He just asked why he was being pulled over. "That's not resisting." Diaz shot the officer a furious glare. "Are you telling me how to do my job?" Fiona saw the moment. "This can end right now if you just step back and de-escalate." A swirl of confusion crossed Diaz's features. The situation had spiraled out of his control, and his usual tactic of intimidation wasn't working, especially not with the cameras and Fiona present. After a tense pause, he roughly released the mechanic's arm. "Fine," he growled, "but don't think you're off the hook." Fiona quickly moved to the man's side, helping him steady himself. "You all right?" she asked softly. He nodded shakily, eyes filled with gratitude. Diaz turned to the younger officer. "Get him written up for the traffic violation," he ordered, his voice tight with frustration. Fiona stared at Diaz, letting her anger glimmer in her gaze. "You'll be hearing from Internal Affairs," she said quietly, so only he could hear. He scowled. "That's so." She didn't blink. "That's so." The onlookers continued recording, but Diaz was clearly trying to regain composure, adjusting his belt and posture. He waved off the crowd. "Everyone, get out of here," he demanded. Fiona felt a wave of relief and renewed fury that mirrored the night before. This man had no business wearing a badge. She wondered if her complaint would move fast enough to stop him before he seriously hurt someone. As she walked away, the mechanic man whispered a quiet, "Thank you." Fiona nodded. She didn't want praise, she just wanted accountability. She had the skill set to see it through, and that resolve hardened in her mind. Within hours, videos of the altercation began circulating on social media. Fiona's face was visible in several angles, though only briefly. More prominently, the camera captured Diaz's aggressive behavior, culminating in his manhandling of the mechanic. Although it wasn't the first time a video showed an officer stepping out of line, something about this incident touched a raw nerve in the community. Local activists picked it up, demanding Diaz's suspension. People began sharing stories of Diaz's aggressive conduct, fueling a collective outcry. Fiona, unsuspecting, found herself drawn into the public eye. She had been prepared to fight this battle quietly, but it was now going viral across local channels and even beyond. In the days that followed, Diaz found himself the subject of intense scrutiny. The police department felt pressure to respond, launching a formal inquiry. Diaz seethed at the growing condemnation, focusing his blame squarely on Fiona. In his mind, if she hadn't meddled, everything would have blown over, as it always had. Fiona, for her part, was guided by her father to speak with a civil rights attorney. She also made contact with the department's Internal Affairs Division. But the question burned in her mind. How far would Diaz go to protect himself? The sun had just set when Fiona headed back to her father's house alone, after a day spent filing paperwork with her attorney. Ka was out visiting a friend for the evening. The sky was a swirl of pink and orange that gradually darkened to a deep purple. As she pulled into the driveway, she was rummaging through her purse for the house keys when her phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number read, "Leave town if you know what's good for you." Fiona's pulse quickened. She had faced threats before, from foreign adversaries no less, but receiving one in the backyard of her hometown rattled her. She steadied her breath. Could it be Diaz or someone associated with him? She filed the number away in her mind, quickly screenshotting the message. She stepped into the house, turning on a few lights, making sure to check all the locks. Alone in the quiet interior, she felt an unsettling sense of vulnerability. She'd come home to celebrate her father's birthday, and ended up in the midst of a conflict that was intensifying by the hour. She settled down at the kitchen table, phone in hand, and typed a text to her father. "Dad, just got a threatening message on my phone. I'm okay, just letting you know. Let me know when you're on your way back." She thought about calling the police, but after Diaz's behavior, her trust in the local force was frayed. Instead, she reached out to Sergeant Lori, the duty sergeant she had met at the station, the one who seemed sympathetic. She left him a voicemail, detailing the threat. Her instincts told her that Diaz, or someone in his circle, might be trying to intimidate her. If so, it was only a matter of time before more significant threats emerged. Still, she was no helpless civilian. She may have been on leave, but her skill set was honed for dealing with hostiles. Fiona retreated to her SUV and retrieved one of her duffel bags, discreetly bringing it inside. She had personal protection items, though she'd have to be mindful of local laws. She also had a habit of carrying a small sidearm, licensed and legal. Quietly, she locked herself in her old bedroom, leaning the gun case in a corner for easy access. Her father's house was small, with only a couple of ways in or out, so she did a quick check of the windows and doors, verifying that everything was locked or barred. An uneasy calm settled over her as she waited. Hours passed. The clock on the wall ticked with maddening slowness. Then, close to midnight, she heard a car outside. She stood, her posture tense, heart pounding. Her father wasn't supposed to be back for another hour. She crept to the window and peered through the blinds. A dark vehicle idled across the street, headlights off. She couldn't make out the driver. The silhouette lingered for a few long minutes. Then the car drove away. Fiona tried to capture the license plate with her phone's camera, but it was too dark. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from an unknown number. "Not so tough without your uniform, are you?" Anger and fear coiled in her belly. She typed back, "Who is this?" But there was no reply. She understood intimidation tactics. She'd used them herself in foreign contexts, to flush out potential threats or cause them to make mistakes. But now, she was the target. Eventually, her father returned, and she filled him in. He was livid. "We're calling the police," he insisted. Fiona hesitated, then nodded. "Let's request Sergeant Lori," she said. Lori arrived about 20 minutes later, looking tired but concerned. He examined Fiona's phone, noting the messages. She told him about the car across the street. "We can do a drive-by patrol," Lori said. "I'll make a note of the number. If it's a burner phone, that complicates things, but we'll see what we can do." Fiona studied Lori's face. "You think Diaz is capable of this?" Lori exhaled, his shoulders slumping. "I can't say for certain, but I know he's angry. The department's launched a deeper investigation into his conduct. He might be spooked, or it could be someone else who sides with him." Kyle Blue let out a low growl. "We want protection," he declared. "My daughter's done enough for this country to deserve that." Lori nodded. "I'll pass the message to my captain. Just be careful. If you see anything suspicious, call us immediately." After Lori left, Fiona and her father sat in the living room, the old lamp casting long shadows on the walls. The weight of the situation pressed on them. "I won't run," Fiona said softly, "no matter what they do." Kyle placed a hand on her shoulder. "No, we won't. We stand our ground." Despite the tension, Fiona felt a surge of reassurance. She wasn't alone. She had her father by her side, and she had the unwavering resolve to see this through. In another twist of fate, the coverage of the convenience store incident had expanded beyond local media. A major network picked up the story, highlighting the local community's uproar and Fiona's role in intervening. They didn't initially name her rank or unit, but word was spreading that she was a high-ranking Army officer who had been harassed by a cop and who had then stood up for another victim. A storm was brewing, and Diaz's downfall seemed all but certain. However, cornered animals sometimes fight hardest, and Diaz was not about to back down without a desperate, destructive struggle. Officer Corey Diaz was simmering. He had watched the videos of himself being berated online. His own department had placed him on administrative leave, pending the outcome of an investigation. Everywhere he turned, he felt the stares and disapproval of others. At home, in a cluttered living room with half-drawn curtains, Diaz paced back and forth, phone in hand, reading text messages from acquaintances who still sympathized with him. A few were equally bigoted and offered him their private support, but even they were scared to defend him publicly. Diaz's wife had left for her sister's place, taking their son with her. She was embarrassed by the allegations and didn't want the press harassing them. Diaz, consumed by fury, found no solace or reason in the face of these repercussions. Instead, he blamed one person, Fiona Blue. In a twisted mental loop, he convinced himself that she was orchestrating everything, destroying his career, publicly shaming him. He remembered how she'd stood on the roadside, stoic, defying his authority. He recalled how she'd intervened at the convenience store. One night, after a few too many drinks, Diaz stared at his phone and typed a series of threatening messages. Something about the idea of scaring her, forcing her to retreat, made him feel powerful again. He pressed send, ignoring that his actions were essentially incriminating him further. Each day, more stories emerged about Diaz's misconduct. People came forward with their own testimonies of intimidation, racism, and questionable searches. The local department's internal investigation accelerated. There was even talk of potential criminal charges if certain allegations proved valid. Desperate, Diaz called a union representative, who advised him to stay quiet and let the investigation run its course. But Diaz's anger wouldn't let him rest. He obsessed over Fiona, or that stuck-up soldier, as he called her, until he concocted a twisted plan. He had one card left to play. He'd heard rumors that Fiona had returned from an overseas post that might still be classified. He had no real understanding of how military intelligence worked, but he assumed that if he could dig up something incriminating, anything, he could shift attention away from himself. With a few shady connections, Diaz tried to gather information about Fiona. He learned her father's address, her rank, and that she was soon to be assigned to Fort Hood in Texas. He also discovered she had top-secret clearance. In Diaz's mind, that meant she might be harboring secrets. Maybe he could paint her as a national security threat. Maybe he could cast doubt on her legitimacy. If he could muddy the waters, the public might question her credibility, and the internal affairs investigation might be overshadowed. Of course, Diaz lacked the intelligence or resources to truly harm her military career, but that didn't stop him from trying. He used a burner phone to text her again, referencing her work in intelligence, hoping to rattle her, to make her fear that something personal or professional might be exposed. When Fiona didn't cower, Diaz grew even more volatile. His final meltdown was all but inevitable. Days later, Fiona found herself standing in her father's living room, reading through a forwarded email. It was from an unidentified address, claiming to have evidence that Fiona had violated national security protocols. The email threatened to release damaging information unless she backed off her complaint against Officer Diaz. Fiona recognized the tactic, a flimsy attempt at blackmail. She also recognized that any evidence would likely be forged or irrelevant. Nonetheless, it made her stomach twist with disgust and apprehension. She showed the email to her father and then called her attorney. They agreed to forward it to Army authorities. Fiona's superiors would certainly see through the ruse, especially once she explained the context. Yet the question remained, how had Diaz gotten even a shred of legitimate information about her deployment? She suspected he might have connections in the department who had access to law enforcement databases. Regardless, she wasn't about to let fear silence her. Later that afternoon, Fiona had a meeting scheduled with the police chief and an internal affairs investigator regarding her formal complaint. She arrived at the station, stepping through the doors with a steady stride. The building buzzed with tension. Officers rushed around, phones rang incessantly, and there was a tangible sense of a storm swirling. Chief Tony Rossi, a tall, graying man with a stern expression, greeted her in a small conference room. A woman from Internal Affairs, Detective Saramoto, sat beside him, flipping through a file. "Lieutenant Colonel Blue," Rossi said, "we appreciate your time. Please, have a seat." Fiona took a seat at a small table. She noticed the blinds were drawn, the atmosphere serious. Moto cleared her throat. "We've been reviewing the footage and multiple complaints. We also have your statement and the statement of your father." She glanced at Fiona. "It's compelling, to say the least." Chief Rossi nodded. Internal Affairs is recommending immediate suspension for Officer Diaz, pending final disciplinary action, potentially termination. Fiona felt a wave of relief. "Thank you. I hope this will prevent any further harm. But Officer Diaz has already sent me threats. I'm concerned for my safety, and for my father's." Moto pursed her lips. "We're aware of that. Local authorities are on the lookout, and a judge has signed a restraining order. Diaz is supposed to stay away from you. If he contacts you again, he can be arrested." Rossi exhaled. We also found out he was using police resources to gather intel on you. That's a serious breach. It won't be taken lightly. Fiona pressed her hands together on the table. I understand. Thank you for informing me. But you should know he's not going to go quietly. He's threatened to release information about my military career that he claims is incriminating. It's nonsense, but it could still create chaos. Moto's expression hardened. We'll do what we can. Are you comfortable staying in town, or do you want to coordinate with Army security? Fiona considered. I may have to contact my CO, but for now I can handle myself. I just don't want my father hurt in any crossfire. Rossi nodded, then stood, indicating the meeting was over. We'll keep you updated. In the meantime, if you see or hear from him, call us immediately. We're going to make sure he's disarmed and on leave, awaiting the hearing. Fiona thanked them and left, feeling a surge of triumph that justice was, at least partially, in motion. Yet a nagging unease remained. She walked across the station lobby and stepped out into the late afternoon sun. The evening sky was a mosaic of oranges and pinks when Fiona left the police station. She drove home with her windows partially down, letting the warm Georgia air wash over her. As she pulled into her father's driveway, she noticed something odd. The front door stood ajar. Immediately, her senses sharpened. She parked quietly, exited the SUV, and approached the door with careful steps. "Dad?" she called softly, stepping inside. A crash echoed from the living room. Adrenaline surged. She slipped back outside and dashed to her SUV, retrieving her sidearm from the locked container. She moved in a low crouch back into the house, training kicking in. Inside, the living room lights were off. She heard a rustle in the kitchen, the sound of rummaging. Then, she heard her father's voice, muffled. Fiona's pulse pounded. She glanced around the corner. In the dim light, she could make out her father, his arms raised. Standing opposite him, breathing heavily, was Diaz, still in partial uniform, his face twisted with desperation. He looked like a man on the edge. "You think you can destroy my life?" Diaz hissed, not yet aware of Fiona's presence. "Your daughter humiliated me. She's trying to get me fired, ruined everything." Kyle Blue held his hands up calmly. "Officer, this isn't the way." Fiona silently eased around the doorway, her weapon at the ready, but aimed low. She didn't want to startle him into shooting. Diaz kicked a chair, sending it scraping across the floor. "I've been suspended, do you hear me? They're calling me a racist. I lost my reputation, my wife left, and I know it's all because of her." Kyle tried to keep his voice calm. "Let's talk about this. Put down whatever you're carrying." Diaz's voice cracked. "Shut up. Where's your daughter? She's the one who started this." Fiona inhaled. She could see Diaz was gripping a handgun, not his service weapon, but a personal firearm. Her heart pounded. She stepped forward, weapon raised. "Officer Diaz," she said firmly, voice echoing in the still air, "drop your gun now." Diaz spun, eyes wild. He spotted Fiona, and for a flicker of a second, recognition flashed across his face. Then, his rage boiled over. He leveled his weapon at her father's head. "No!" Fiona shouted, her heart seizing. "You lower yours," Diaz screamed, pressing the barrel against Kyle's temple, "or I pull the trigger." Fiona's training told her that negotiating with a cornered, unstable individual required calm. She forced her voice into a steady tone. "Okay, I'm lowering it," she lied, shifting the muzzle slightly downward, but keeping her finger along the trigger guard. She wouldn't drop it completely, not unless she had no other choice. Kyle, breathing hard, locked eyes with Fiona. She conveyed silent reassurance, hoping he would trust her. Diaz barked, "Throw it aside. Kick it away." Fiona hesitated. If she relinquished her gun entirely, Diaz could do anything. But her father's life hung in the balance. Time seemed to slow. She saw the bead of sweat rolling down Diaz's temple, the nervous twitch of his finger. She pictured the layout of the kitchen, the angle of the counters, and the chairs. She did a rapid mental calculation. "Now!" Diaz roared. Fiona slowly bent, placing her firearm on the ground. She slid it away with her foot, never taking her gaze off Diaz. Diaz exhaled shakily, nodding to himself. He kept the gun on Kyle, stepping backward. "I should kill you both," he muttered, mania flickering in his eyes. "They'll say it was self-defense, that you attacked me." In that moment, Kyle suddenly shifted to the side, trying to create space between himself and the barrel. Diaz jerked the gun to keep aim on him. That was Fiona's opening. She launched forward, pivoting around Diaz's outstretched arm. Her left hand shot out, striking the inside of his wrist in a well-practiced disarm maneuver. Her right hand latched onto the slide of his gun. A shot cracked through the air, deafening. The bullet buried itself in the floor. Diaz's eyes widened as Fiona twisted his arm. Pain forced him to release the weapon. She slammed her elbow into his chest, sending him sprawling. Kyle dove out of the way, stumbling onto a chair. Diaz, gasping, tried to scramble to his feet. Fiona kicked the fallen gun aside, then tackled Diaz to the ground. She pinned him with her knee on his back, mindful to keep from using lethal force. "Stay down," she ordered. He struggled, sputtering curses, but Fiona pressed her knee more firmly. She snatched a pair of zip ties from a drawer, an old item her father kept around, and quickly restrained Diaz's wrists. Her heart hammered as she patted him down, removing any other weapons. Kyle caught his breath, stumbling forward. "Fiona," he called, voice shaky. She glanced at her father, relief flooding her features. He was unharmed, though clearly shaken. "I'm okay, Dad." Diaz's breathing rasped against the floor. "You," he panted. "You, it's all your fault." Fiona ignored him, pulling out her phone to call the station. "Send help," she said, giving the address. "Officer Diaz is here, armed. I have him restrained." She ended the call. Her gaze flicked to her father, the adrenaline still coursing, her hands trembling slightly as the reality of how close it had been sank in. Kyle stood carefully, stepping around the shattered chair. He placed a hand on Fiona's shoulder. "You saved my life," he said softly. Fiona swallowed hard. "I'm just glad I got here in time." Diaz continued spewing curses, accusing Fiona of setting him up, raving about conspiracies. His voice was ragged with desperation. In the distance, sirens wailed. Fiona locked eyes with her father, and they shared a weary nod. The nightmare was nearly over. The next few hours were a blur. Multiple squad cars arrived, lights flashing. Officers rushed in, guns drawn, to find Fiona kneeling on Diaz's back, his wrists bound. She raised her hands and stood slowly, explaining the situation to the responding officers. Sergeant Laurie arrived, along with Detective Moto, and they surveyed the scene with somber expressions. Laurie instructed the officers to take Diaz into custody. Moto took Fiona's statement while a paramedic checked Kyle for any injuries. Neighbors milled outside, their faces pale with shock, whispering in hushed tones. Diaz's meltdown was complete, and the fallout was swift. He was charged with breaking and entering, brandishing a firearm, and attempted murder. The media descended on the story. The narrative shifted from officer under investigation to disgraced officer arrested after hostage standoff, and Fiona's role as a decorated military intelligence officer became public knowledge. Diaz's arrest made national news for a short cycle, triggering debates on police accountability and racial profiling. Fiona found herself fielding calls from journalists who wanted an interview with the decorated military intelligence officer who had bested a rogue cop. She granted a few, carefully chosen interviews, emphasizing the need for systemic reforms rather than focusing on her own heroics. Her father, too, was vocal in local forums, explaining that this wasn't a case of one bad apple, but a broader issue that needed addressing. Neighbors expressed regret that they hadn't spoken up sooner about Diaz's behavior. Some saw parallels to incidents around the country, a sobering reminder that the struggle for equitable treatment was far from over. But for Fiona, the sense of closure came not from media attention, but from witnessing the unwavering support she received from the local community. Black, white, and everything in between, people rallied around her father's home, bringing food, offering thanks, and apologizing for the ordeal. Fiona learned that some of them had felt powerless in the face of Diaz's aggression. Her actions had emboldened them to believe that change was possible. A few weeks later, Fiona prepared to depart for Fort Hood. She stood in her father's driveway, next to the black SUV that had once been the source of Diaz's suspicion. It was packed with personal effects, and she had her orders folded neatly in the glove box. Kyle came out onto the porch, arms crossed, watching her load the last bag. "You sure you're up for heading straight into a new assignment after all this?" he asked, concern in his voice. Fiona gave a resolute nod. "I'll be fine, Dad. I'm eager to get back to work. Besides, you know me, I can't sit still for long." He smiled, stepping forward to envelope her in a warm hug. "Just promise me you'll keep your head down well, as much as you can. Don't let this overshadow your career." She pulled back, meeting his gaze. "I won't. But I also won't stay silent if I see something wrong. This taught me that staying silent only helps people like Diaz. Kyle nodded, pride shining in his eyes. That's my girl. They said their goodbyes, and Fiona climbed into the driver's seat. The engine purred, and she glanced once more at the house. A mix of relief and sadness filled her. She would miss her father, but she was grateful for the chance to turn the page. As she drove away, the sun was just cresting the horizon. Fiona felt the warmth on her face and recalled a line from her training days. Bravery is being the only one who knows you're afraid. She carried that with her, along with the knowledge that she had stood up for herself and others. Yes, fear had been part of the journey, but so had triumph. She had faced injustice at home, the very home she had sworn to protect, and emerged stronger. And for once, in a world that often deferred justice, the karmic scales had tipped swiftly and unmistakably. Thank you for joining me on this intense, twist-filled journey. We witnessed Lieutenant Colonel Fiona Blue face a test of courage, not on foreign soil, but right here at home, confronted by the very authority she once believed would protect her and her community. In the end, her resilience, and yes, her brilliant military training, became the shield that prevented tragedy and exposed Officer Diaz's true nature. The story reminds us that courage isn't just forged in combat zones. Sometimes the battlefield is our own neighborhood street. Sometimes the heroes are those who quietly do what's right, even when it's not easy. If you found yourself moved, inspired, or outraged by Fiona's journey, let's keep this conversation going. Please like, share, and subscribe so we can continue to shine a light on injustice, celebrate stories of valor, and spark the change we want to see in this world. Thank you for watching.